Hello class, and welcome to our next video lesson. I want you to take a look at the picture on the screen. What are some words that you could use to describe this apple? You may have said words such as red, or that the apple is round, or that the apple may taste sweet. These are all ways of describing matter, which is what's going to be our focus in this next lesson. We're going to be looking at what are called properties of matter, and properties of matter are ways of describing matter. Let's take a look at our standards. Distinguish between physical and chemical properties of matter as physical, for example, density, melting point, boiling point, or chemical, for example, reactivity and combustibility. Let's look at our learning targets. Go ahead and write these learning targets in your notebook on your student-friendly standard sheet, which should be located on page 4 of your notebook. Let's look at these learning targets that we're going to be examining in this particular video lesson. I can explain the difference between physical properties and chemical properties. I can identify examples of physical and chemical properties. So by the end of this video lesson, hopefully we will be closer to mastering these two learning targets. Let's first take a look at physical properties. A physical property is a characteristic that can be observed or measured without changing the identity of matter. These are properties that you can observe or measure, and you don't have to change anything about the matter. For example, when we looked at the picture of the apple on the previous slide, we knew just by looking at it that it had the color red and that it was round. If you were to taste the apple, you could determine whether it's sweet or not. So these are characteristics that you can observe or measure without changing the identity. We could have also measured something about that apple, such as its mass or the length of the apple. These are characteristics that you can measure, which are also physical properties. Any physical property of matter can be detected by using your senses. The examples that we see here are color, size, shape, smell, taste, volume, mass, length, height, width, density, boiling point and melting point, state of matter, and texture. All of these are good examples of physical properties. Let's take a look at some pictures. The apple is red and round. That would be a physical property that can be observed without changing anything about that substance. The boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. This is a property that can be measured without changing anything about that substance. The density of gold is 19.3 grams per centimeters cubed. Once again, this is a measurable type property, so we don't have to change anything about that substance to determine the density of gold. Let's look at some other examples of some physical properties. Conductivity, which is the rate at which a substance is going to transfer heat, would be an example of physical property. So when you're talking about whether something can be an insulator or a conductor, then that is a physical property that you are describing. State of matter, which is something we just previously studied. So if you determine whether a substance is a solid, liquid, or gas, that is also a physical property. Density. Density is the mass per unit volume of a substance. So it's how much mass you have in a certain amount of space, and that is what we call density. This one is measurable. You can figure out the mass, the volume, and then you do a calculation and you figure out the density of an object. So that would be a measured type physical property. Solubility is the ability of a substance to dissolve in another, which is also a physical property. Then you have ductility and malleability. These are physical properties that we often see with metals. Ductility is the ability of a substance to be pulled into a wire. And then malleability is the ability of a substance to be rolled or pounded into thin sheets. So all of these properties are properties that can be observed or measured without changing the identity of the matter. For example, the table that you are currently sitting at, you can look at that table and you can describe some physical properties of that table. For example, you might say that its state of matter is a solid. You may say that it is a rectangle shape. You could also describe the color of it, which it has a black top and silver colored legs. So these are all some examples of some physical properties of matter. Now let us take a look at chemical properties. Chemical properties is a property that can be observed when matter changes into a different type of matter. So now when matter goes through these changes and it changes into something different, that is when we can observe what are called chemical properties. There are three specific chemical properties that we're going to talk about. The first one is flammability. Flammability is the ability to burn. So when a substance has the ability to burn, that would be an example of a chemical property. It's changing into a new substance as it burns. Reactivity is how easily one thing will react with something else. A good example of this would be rusting. If you had some type of metal that rusts, then that rust is going to form on that metal because it's reacting with oxygen in the air and other substances around it that causes that rust to form. Combustibility is the capability of a substance to ignite and burn when combined with oxygen. So all of these are good examples of how matter, when it changes into something different or a different type of matter, you are then observing what we call a chemical property. Let's take a look at some pictures. Vinegar and baking soda react when they are combined, producing bubbles. So this would be an example of reactivity. Therefore, this would be a chemical property. The wood is flammable. You can see the wood in this picture is burning, so that would be an example of a chemical property. When that wood burns, it's going to change into ashes, and it's also going to produce some smoke and gases. So that's going to be that matter changing into something different. So therefore, that's a chemical property that we are observing. Combustibility. Okay, this picture here shows you how combustibility would happen. Fuel, something that will burn, heat enough to make the fuel ignite and burn, and oxygen from the air. So this would be an example of combustibility. When something combusts, it's going to change into another substance that's not what it originally was. Therefore, we are observing a chemical property. Take a look at these 5 examples on just a scratch sheet of paper. Take a few seconds and write down what type of property is being shown in the picture. Okay, let's now check our answers. Number 1, the apple is red and round. If you wrote that one to be a physical property, then you are correct. Number 2, the wood is flammable. If you wrote that one as a chemical property, you are correct. The boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. This is a physical property. This is a property that you can measure. Okay? Number 4, vinegar and baking soda will react when mixed together, producing a gas. This is going to be a chemical property. And look for key words, especially when you are trying to determine what type of property. A really good keyword for chemical properties is definitely the word react. That word will show up often when we're describing different characteristics of matter. So anytime that a substance is reacting with another substance, that is always going to be something chemical that's occurring. It's producing something new that you originally did not have. And then our last one, the density of gold is 19.3 grams per centimeters cubed. This is also a physical property. This is a property that is measurable. All I would need to know is the mass and the volume, and then I could figure out the density of that object. I'm not having to change anything about that substance to determine the density. That is the end of our video lesson. Make sure that you have recorded all of your notes.